Hello, this is the third video in my game character rigging series. In the last video, I created the skeleton for this goblin character. This character comes from The Goblin Abyss, which is an iOS game I'm presently working on. Because it's for iOS and mobile, the character is low res, but this should make the skinning very easy. I'm going to start by adding a skin cluster, so that the skeleton will actually deform the mesh. At the moment, it doesn't really do a lot. So to do this, the first thing I'm going to do is select all the joints I want in the skin cluster. So I'm going to open up the hypergraph and just select everything. Now we don't need these end joints, these are only here for the IK. So I'm going to shift select and deselect them. Now I'm going to shift select the mesh and we're going to go up to skin, smooth bind, and let's open up the options. Okay, so let's look at these options. Bind to, we want selected joints. Because we've selected the joints, we know exactly what's going in there. The bind method, closest in hierarchy, that's fine. The skinning method, we definitely want classic linear because this is going to a game engine. Normalize weights, we always want the weights to add up to a value of 1. Making sure this is on interactive will do that. Allow multiple bind poses. When we create a skin cluster, it also creates a bind pose on the joints, which is basically the skeleton's pose when we skinned the mesh. This can then be used to go back to our skinning position later if we've posed the skeleton. Personally, I prefer to just have one position for rigging, so I'm going to leave this off. Max influences. This is how many joints can affect the same vertex. In low-res games, this is a very important number, because it takes longer to calculate the deformation for multiple joints. So you really want the least amount of joints to influence a vertex. This character is for iOS, so I'm going to set the default to 1. Maintain max influences. If this is on, Maya will limit your skin weights to the maximum influence number. If it's off, then the max influence number will only be used to calculate the initial weights when we hit the bind skin button in a minute. I always leave this off because it can sometimes get confusing if you're painting skin weights and Maya is trying to keep the maximum influence value. I've also set the maximum influence number to 1, and I know I'm going to need at least 2 on a few of these vertices. Drop-off rate. This is used to calculate the initial skin weights, and normally its default of 4 is fine. But most of our skin weights are going to be manually altered anyway. Remove unused influences. If you have a joint that isn't near the mesh and after binding it didn't receive any skin weights, this option will remove it from the skin cluster. I'm binding to selected joints because I want full control over what's in my skin cluster, so I'm going to leave this off. And lastly, colorize skeleton. Personally, I hate the colours, but this one's really up to you. So let's hit bind skin. So now our skeleton finally deforms the mesh. Let's see how it does. Actually, this isn't too bad for the initial bind. Yeah, there's some iffy ones. Well, let's start with the hands. Let's select this and see how it looks. Oh, it's not looking too bad, but let's open up the component editor. And we're going to switch to the Smooth Skins tab. We can now select vertices and see what their skin weights are. So you can see the whole hand is only being deformed by J wrist left. If we select these, they're all by the elbow. So as you can see, we're getting this sort of wrung out effect on the hand here, which doesn't look very good. Although this is for iPhone and it's a small screen, he'll be viewed from a distance, that might actually be okay. But for now I'm going to select these. I'm going to make sure hide zero columns is turned off so I can see all my joints. And I'm going to add a little influence from the wrist. J wrist left. Let's start with 0.45. So now we get a little bit of deformation there, but up and down isn't working very well. Now one way to fix this is to add twist joints up the wrist. This character isn't really high enough res for that, and I don't think I need it. So instead what I think I'm going to do is move these vertices a little closer. But because he's UV textured and now skinned, you can't just move the vertices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the polygons menu, go to edit mesh, and I'm going to insert an edge loop. Nope. Start by selecting the mesh. Now I go insert edge loop, and I'm going to place one. Actually, I'm going to place it right in the middle. So I'm going to double check, make this 0.5. That way I can do exactly the same over here. I hit the G key to repeat, insert, and 0.5 again. I can now select this edge loop and use delete edge vertex to remove it, and I'll do the same over this side. Now the problem with doing this is now if we look in our history, we can see we have the deletes in the poly split. So to fix that, I'm going to make sure the mesh is selected. I'm going to go to edit, delete by type, non-deformer history. We can ignore this warning, and you can see now we're back to just the skin cluster, which means we can now go in, select these vertices, and they should show up in the component editor. And they're there, so let's select these ones. Did I get them all? Yes. Again, I'm just going to set them first of all auto elbow, and then 0.45. And let's see how that deforms. That's definitely better up and down. And there's a bit of a twist. I think for this character, that's going to look fine. So next we're going to look at the elbow. Let's select it and see how it deforms. Actually, that's not too bad, but I'm going to make sure this middle edge loop gets influence from both the elbow and the shoulder joint. So I'm just going to quickly select all the vertices. I'm going to go back to the component editor. I'm going to set the elbow to 1 and set the shoulder to 0.5. Let's see how that looks. Actually, I think the outside is good, the inside. Let's go back to the component editor. And let's give it a tiny bit more on the elbow, perhaps 0.65. I think that's looking good for this character. So now I'm going to look at the shoulder. And this one definitely needs some work. I think I'm going to start by doing the same thing. Select this edge loop, go back to component editor. I have to view all my joints and go find the shoulder. Shoulder left. So I'm going to start by adding that to 0.5. So we get a nice even blend between the two joints. Actually, that's looking okay. As we saw earlier, I know the head needs a bit of work. So I'm just going to select all the vertices in the head, about there. Again, the component editor, I'm going to hide these and just make sure all of those selected verts are only deformed by the head joint. Now again, this row and these, I think I'm going to add a blend between the neck and the head joint. So let's go find the head joint, and let's try 0.5. That should work. Now, as you can see from here, we're just really going to select all the joints, check their weights, and make adjustments to all the vertex weights in the component editor. Now, you could sit here and watch me do this, but it's going to get boring fast. So instead, I'm going to pause the video and quickly fix all the weights on this character. So this version now has most of his weights fixed up. So I'll quickly show you what some of the things I did. Things like this arm here. I added a little extra influence on this one and lessened the influence here. So if we go into the component editor again, see this one's more like 0.7 from the clavicle joint and 0.3 from the shoulder. And then down here I went for nearly halfway. And it just rounded off the shoulder a lot nicer. Things like the knee. Again, we have the central edge loop is pretty much 0.5 between the two joints, pretty close. But I have this triangular shape here, so I can put more influence on the hip joint on this one, and then the lower one has more influence on the actual knee joint. And we end up with that sort of shape. Now, while doing this, one way is to add animation. So if I quickly go back to bind pose, if I was going to work on these weights here, you could add a keyframe to the shoulder. Go forward, say 8 frames, and bend it down. Add another keyframe. And now his arm will move. But now you can go in, select the vertices, open up the component editor, and you can instantly see what your changes are doing. So we go in here, say I didn't like that, let's change that to 0.8, and you can see instantly what it looks like. Switch those back to, actually I'm going to undo that. And the other thing to remember is you only really need to paint the weights, or set the weights on one side. Once you've set everything on the left side you like, as long as you're in bind pose, just skin, go to bind pose, you can select the mesh, go to skin, edit smooth skin, and mirror skin weights. If we open up the options, you can see I want to mirror across the YZ plane. I want to go from positive to negative. I always set the surface association to closest point on surface and influence association to 1 to 1. I find that gives me the best results. And if you hit apply, all the weights you fixed on this side will now be mirrored onto the other side. Well, I seem to be running out of time, so I guess that's it for this video. In the next one, I'll start on the animation rig, starting with the spine controls.